In 1940, the German Blitz surged through northern France, pushing the Allies into a bewildered retreat. This episode covers May through June 1940, the rapid advance of panzer units and the halt order issued on May 16th, de Gaulle's makeshift counterattacks, the British Expeditionary Force's strategic withdrawal, and the unsuccessful Arras offensive, the capture of Boulogne and Calais, and the events at Dunkirk, what was saved, what was lost, and the reasons behind it all. We'll explore the political fall in Paris, the rivalry between Churchill and Halifax in London, Mussolini's involvement, the second German advance over the Somme and Aisne, the abandonment of Paris, Pétain's request for an armistice, and de Gaulle's rallying call on June 18th. Expect clear timelines, crucial decisions, and the human toll, including atrocities against colonial troops, concluding with France's defeat and Britain preparing for the Battle of Britain. German morale soared. Tank crews in their black uniforms cheered their leaders as they pushed towards the Channel, navigating through empty landscapes, refueling at abandoned gas stations and French army depots. Their supply routes remained wide open, with delays primarily caused by roads clogged with broken-down French vehicles and refugee streams. As Kleist's tanks charged toward the coast, Hitler grew increasingly nervous about a potential French counterattack from the south. The typically bold leader couldn't believe his good fortune. Memories of 1914, when an invasion of France was thwarted by a counteroffensive, haunted the older generals. General Oberst von Rundstedt sided with Hitler, ordering Kleist to pause on May 16th to let the infantry catch up. Yet, General Halder, who had recently embraced the boldness of Manstein's strategy, urged him to continue. The next day, Kleist and Guderian clashed again, with Kleist citing Hitler's orders. Ultimately, a compromise allowed battle-worthy reconnaissance formations to advance toward the coast, while the headquarters of the 19th Corps remained stationary. This opened the door for Guderian, who understood that the French were paralyzed by the audacity of the German offensive. Only scattered pockets of resistance persisted, with remnants of some French divisions continuing to fight amid overwhelming odds. By sheer chance, the same day the Panzer divisions stopped for a well-deserved break to maintain their vehicles, a counterattack from the French began in the south. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, a strong advocate for armored warfare in the French army, had just received command of the so-called 4th Armored Division. His fierce promotion of mechanized tactics earned him the nickname Colonel Motors. However, the 4th Armored was a mismatched collection of tank battalions lacking sufficient infantry support and nearly devoid of artillery. General Georges briefed him and sent him off with the words, "Go on, de Gaulle. For you who have long embraced the ideas the enemy is employing, here is your chance to act." Eager to retaliate, de Gaulle was angered by the impudence of the German panzer crews, who, as they sped past French troops, ordered them to drop their weapons and march east. Their dismissive remark of, "We haven't got time to take you prisoner," fueled his patriotic outrage. From Laon, de Gaulle aimed to advance northeast toward Montcornet, a vital crossroads on Guderian's supply route. The swift move of the 4th Armored Division caught the Germans off guard and nearly penetrated the headquarters of the 1st Panzer Division. However, the Germans quickly responded, deploying some freshly repaired tanks and self-propelled guns, while the Luftwaffe provided air support. With de Gaulle's weary force lacking anti-aircraft defenses and fighter support, they were forced to retreat. Unsurprisingly, Guderian did not inform Rundstedt's Army Group headquarters about the day's events. On the evening of May 15th, the BEF, which had successfully fended off German attacks in its section of the Dial, was taken aback to learn that General Gaston Belote, the commander of the 1st Army Group, was planning to withdraw to the line along the river Escaut, which meant abandoning Brussels and Antwerp. The Belgian generals only found out about this decision the following morning and reacted with fury at the insufficient notice. Belote's headquarters were in turmoil, with many officers visibly distressed. Gort's chief of staff, alarmed by what he'd learned from the British liaison officer, called the War Office in London to alert them that the BEF might face evacuation at some point. For the British, the 16th of May marked the beginning of a tactical withdrawal. Just south of Brussels, on a ridge near Waterloo, Royal Artillery units stationed their 25-pounder guns. This time, their sights were set on Wavre, the point from which the Prussians had advanced to support their ancestors in 1815. However, by nightfall the next day, German forces were moving into the Belgian capital. On that day, Renault sent a message to General Maxime Weygand in Syria, requesting him to return to France to assume supreme command. He had resolved to remove Gamelin, regardless of Daladier's opinions. He also planned to reshuffle his ministers. Georges Mandel, who had been a key ally of the former Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and was committed to fighting until the end, would take on the role of Minister of the Interior. Renault himself appointed himself as the Minister of War and aimed to bring in Charles de Gaulle, now holding the temporary rank of a junior general, as Under-Secretary of State. Renault's resolve was strengthened the following day when he heard from writer André Maurois, who was serving as a liaison officer, that although the British were holding their ground, they had completely lost faith in the French army, and particularly its senior leadership. Yet, Renault made a critical error around that same time, likely swayed by his surrender-minded partner, Hélène de Porte. He dispatched a representative to Madrid to persuade Marshal Philippe Pétain, then serving as France's ambassador to Franco, to become his deputy prime minister. Pétain's reputation as the victor of Verdun had granted him a heroic image. However, the 84-year-old marshal, like Weygand, was more concerned about the threat of revolution and the potential collapse of the French army than the likelihood of defeat. He, much like many on the right, believed that France had been unjustly thrust into this conflict by the British. On the morning of the 18th of May, just 8 days after Churchill had assumed the role of Prime Minister, and while the Germans were poised to encircle the British Expeditionary Force in northern France, Randolph Churchill paid a visit to his father. The Prime Minister, while shaving, told him to read the newspaper until he was done. Suddenly, he remarked, "I think I see my way through," and returned to his task. His astonished son responded, "Do you mean that we can avoid defeat or beat the bastards?" Churchill put down his razor and turned to face him. "Of course I mean we can beat them." "Well, I'm all for it, but I don't see how you can do it." His father wiped his face before stating with intense conviction, "I will pull the United States in." Coincidentally, it was also the day the government, prompted by Halifax, assigned the austere socialist Sir Stafford Cripps to Moscow to improve relations with the Soviet Union. Churchill believed Cripps was a poor choice, reasoning that Stalin loathed socialists even more than conservatives. He also thought that Cripps, with his idealistic views, wasn't suited to handle a rough, mistrustful, and calculating individual like Stalin. However, Cripps proved to be more visionary than the Prime Minister in some respects. He had already foreseen that the war would signal the end of the British Empire and bring about significant social changes afterwards. On May 19th, the German salient, now referred to as the Panzer Corridor, stretched across the Canal du Nord. Both Guderian and Rommel needed to allow their crews some rest, yet Rommel convinced his corps commander to press on that night toward Arras. The RAF units in France were completely isolated from British ground forces, leading to the decision to withdraw the 66 remaining Hurricanes back to Britain. The French felt betrayed by this action, but the loss of airfields and the fatigue of the pilots made it necessary. The RAF had already lost a quarter of its total fighter force during the Battle of France. Meanwhile, far to the south, General Erwin von Witzlebin's First Army became the first to break through the Maginot Line. This was intended to prevent the French from mobilizing forces against the southern flank of the Panzer Corridor, although that flank was beginning to be secured by exhausted German infantry divisions arriving from forced marches. Colonel de Gaulle launched another northward assault that day, advancing with 150 tanks toward Crécy-sur-Serre. He had been assured of fighter support by the French Air Force to counter Stuka assaults, but poor communication meant help arrived too late. De Gaulle had to retreat with what remained of his forces across the River Aisne. Ongoing poor communication among the Allied armies bred suspicions that the BEF was contemplating evacuation. General Lord Gort didn't dismiss the possibility, but no plans were in place yet. He struggled to get a clear answer from General Billout regarding the real situation to their south and what reserves the French could muster. In London, General Ironside contacted the Admiralty to inquire about the small ships they had on hand. Although the British public was largely unaware of the dire situation, anxious rumors began to spread that the King and Queen were sending Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose to Canada, that Italy had already joined the war and its troops were advancing into Switzerland, that German paratroopers had landed, and that Lord Haw-Haw was relaying secret messages to German agents in Britain through his broadcasts from Berlin. On the final day of General Gamelin's command, the French government attended a service at Notre Dame, praying for divine assistance. The Francophile American ambassador, William Bullitt, was moved to tears during the ceremony. General Weygand, small and full of energy, with a weathered fox-like face, insisted on getting a good night's sleep after his lengthy flight from Syria. This pro-monarchist was an unexpected choice, given his disdain for Renaud, who had appointed him. However, in a moment of desperation, Renaud sought out symbols of past victories in figures like Pétain and Weygand, who had been Fox deputy during the triumph of 1918. On Monday, May 20th, the first day under Weygand's command, the 1st Panzer Division arrived in Amiens, which had been heavily bombed just a day earlier. A battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment, the only Allied troops in the city, was devastated in a futile defense. Guderian's forces also established a bridgehead over the River Somme, gearing up for the next phase of the battle. He then ordered the Austrian 2nd Panzer Division to advance on Abbeville, reaching it by that evening. Just hours later, one of its panzer battalions made it to the coast. Manstein's Sichelschnitt had been successfully executed. Hitler, overjoyed, struggled to believe the news. The surprise was so significant that the Army High Command was at a loss for their next move. Meanwhile, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had advanced to Arras, but was stopped by a battalion of the Welsh Guards. That evening, General Ironside arrived at Gort's headquarters with an order from Churchill to push through the corridor and link up with the French on the southern side. However, Gort explained that the majority of his divisions were occupied defending the Scheldt line and could not be redeployed at that moment. He was planning a 2-division assault on Arras, but he was completely unaware of the French strategy. Ironside then made his way to Billout's headquarters. The large Ironside found the French general in a state of utter despair and, without hesitation, shook him by the tunic. Eventually, Billout agreed to mount a simultaneous counterattack with another 2 divisions. Gort was very doubtful that anything would come of it, and he turned out to be right. General René Altmaier, who led the French Vif Corps assigned to support the British, was reportedly weeping on his bed, according to a French liaison officer. Only a small unit from General Prieux's commendable cavalry corps came to their aid. This kind of story doesn't come from Wikipedia. It's the result of extensive research, primary sources, and first-hand accounts, made freely available here. If you found value in this, subscribing is the easiest way to support this type of work, and we would greatly appreciate it. Now, back to the video. The British counterattack around Arras aimed to take control of land south of the city to cut off Rommel's armored advance. The forces mainly included 74 Matilda tanks from the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, 2 battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, part of the Northumberland Fusiliers, and the armored cars of the 12th Lancers. Once again, the promised artillery support and air cover for the operation never materialized. Rommel watched in disbelief as his infantry and gunners fled in panic. The recently arrived SS Totenkopf Mechanized Infantry Division was also filled with fear. But Rommel quickly deployed some anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns against the slow-moving Matilda tanks. He nearly lost his life in the chaos, yet his bold actions, stepping in like a junior officer, likely prevented a serious setback for the Germans. Another British unit performed better, although many of their tanks experienced mechanical failures. The German anti-tank rounds couldn't penetrate the thick armor of the remaining Matildas, but eventually, several succumbed to breakdowns after inflicting significant damage on German armored and softer vehicles. Despite a valiant effort, the counterattack simply lacked the necessary strength and support to meet its objectives. The failure of the French forces, with the notable exception of Prieux's cavalry, to engage in the conflict convinced British leaders that their army had lost its fighting spirit. The alliance, much to Churchill's dismay, was now on the brink of unraveling into distrust and blame. The French attempted another counterattack near Cambrai, but it yielded minimal results. That morning, the British Expeditionary Force faced a heavy assault along the Escaut line, but resisted fiercely against the Germans, earning 2 Victoria Crosses in the process. The Germans, unwilling to suffer more casualties in another attack, switched to bombarding the British with artillery and mortars. Just as the entire Allied position was about to falter due to poor communication and misunderstandings among top commanders, Weygand called for a conference in Ypres that afternoon. He aimed to have the British withdraw to mount a stronger offensive towards the Somme. However, Gort was out of the loop and arrived far too late. Additionally, Weygand's agreement with King Leopold III to keep Belgian troops stationed in Belgium turned disastrous. This was worsened by the death of General Billat, whose staff car collided with a truck filled with refugees. General Weygand and some French commentators later insinuated that Gort deliberately missed the meeting at Ypres as he was secretly planning to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force, yet there's no proof of this. A German soldier from the 269th Infantry Division wrote home on May 20th, describing the grim reality of war. Towns and villages wrecked, shops looted, values trampled underfoot, abandoned cattle, and dogs wandering aimlessly. He noted the stark contrast of their lives in France, where meat was easy to come by, and luxuries like asparagus, oranges, and chocolate were plentiful. He reflected on how the long marches caused them to lose contact with their units, often leading them to break into homes to satisfy their hunger, dismissing the horror of it with, "But one gets used to anything. Thank God these conditions don't exist back home." An artillery corporal wrote to his wife about the countless shattered French tanks and vehicles lining the roads, noting there were surprisingly few German ones among them. Some soldiers expressed frustration at having so little to occupy their time. A corporal from the 1st Infantry Division noted that many divisions had yet to engage in combat. He remarked that at the front, the enemy was retreating, as the French and British, once equal adversaries in the World War, now avoided confrontation. He declared that their aircraft commanded the skies, with not a single enemy plane in sight, only their own. Positions like Amiens, Laon, and Chemin des Dames fell within hours, whereas during the previous war, those areas were contested for years. However, the triumphant letters home conveniently overlooked the tragic slaughters of British and French prisoners, as well as the frequent killings of captured French colonial soldiers, particularly the brave Senegalese tirailleurs, who faced the brutal anger of German troops. These soldiers were executed en masse, sometimes 50 or 100 at a time, by German units including the SS Totenkopf, the 10th Panzer Division, and the Grossdeutschland Regiment. It is estimated that as many as 3,000 colonial soldiers were shot after being taken prisoner during the Battle of France. Meanwhile, Boulogne, situated behind the British and French forces, was in disarray, with some French naval personnel intoxicated and others destroying coastal batteries. To defend the town, battalions of Irish Guards and Welsh Guards were deployed. On May 22nd, as the 2nd Panzer Division advanced towards the port, it was ambushed by a detachment of the French 48th Regiment, primarily headquarters staff, operating unfamiliar anti-tank guns. This act of bravery sharply contrasted with the chaos in Boulogne, but the defenders were soon overwhelmed as the 2nd Panzer Division pressed on to assault the port. The Guards battalions had limited anti-tank weaponry and were quickly forced to retreat into the town, establishing a defensive perimeter around the port. Realizing they could not hold Boulogne, British rear echelon units began evacuation by Royal Navy destroyers on May 23rd. An intense battle ensued, with British warships entering the port and engaging German tanks with their main guns. However, the French commander, who had been ordered to fight to the last man, was furious, accusing the British of desertion, which further strained relations among the Allies. This incident also fueled Churchill's determination to defend Calais at all costs. Calais, despite being bolstered by 4 battalions and some tanks, stood little chance of withstanding the onslaught, even with orders against evacuation for the sake of Allied solidarity. On May 25th, the 10th Panzer Division unleashed Stukas and heavy artillery onto the old town where the remaining defenders had retreated. The fighting in Calais persisted the following day. The flames consuming the town were visible from Dover. French troops battled until their ammunition was exhausted, leading their naval commander to opt for surrender, while the British, having suffered significant losses, had no choice but to do the same. Though the defense of Calais was ultimately hopeless, it managed to delay the 10th Panzer Division's march along the coast toward Dunkirk. Back in Britain, civilian morale remained steady, partly due to a lack of awareness regarding the dire situation across the Channel. However, Renault's alarming comment, stating that only a miracle can save France, raised concerns on May 22nd, awakening the nation to the reality. The Emergency Powers Act received broad approval, along with the arrest of Sir Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Mass observation noted a more determined spirit in rural areas compared to the larger towns, with women displaying less confidence than men. Among classes, the middle class was notably more anxious than the working class. As the saying went, the whiter the collar, the less the assurance. In fact, the wealthier and upper classes demonstrated the highest levels of defeatism. Many became convinced that outrageous rumors, such as claims that General Gamlin was shot as a traitor or had taken his own life, were being deliberately circulated by a fifth column. Yet, mass observation reported to the Ministry of Information that the evidence indicated most rumors stemmed from idle, fearful, and suspicious individuals. On May 23rd, General Brooke, commander of 2 Corps, penned in his diary, "Nothing but a miracle can save the BEF now. The end cannot be far off." Luckily for the British Expeditionary Force, the failed counterattack at Arras had made the Germans more cautious. Rundstedt and Hitler maintained that securing the area was crucial before resuming the advance. The delays faced by the 10th Panzer Division at Boulogne and Calais prevented Dunkirk from being captured behind the backs of the BEF. On the evening of May 23rd, General Oberst von Kluge brought to a stop the 13 German divisions along what the British referred to as the Canal Line, situated on the western edge of the emerging Dunkirk pocket. This line stretched just over 50 kilometers from the Channel along the River A and its canal, passing through Saint-Omer, Bethune, and La Bassée. Kleist's 2 Panzer Corps were in desperate need of vehicle maintenance, having already lost half of their armored strength. In just 3 weeks, 600 tanks either fell to enemy action or suffered significant mechanical issues, which accounted for more than a sixth of the total German forces across all fronts. The following day, Hitler authorized this order, but it wasn't his direct intervention, as is commonly believed. General Oberst von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, supported by Halder, issued the command on the night of May 24 to continue advancing. However, Rundstedt, backed by Hitler, insisted that the infantry should first catch up. Their goal was to preserve their panzer forces for an attack across the Somme and Aisne before the main body of the French army had a chance to regroup. They deemed an advance through the canals and wetlands of Flanders an unnecessary risk, especially since Göring claimed his Luftwaffe would handle any British evacuation efforts. Despite marching swiftly, the German infantry divisions struggled to keep pace with the panzer units. Notably, the British Expeditionary Force and most French units had significantly more motor transport than the German army, where only 16 out of 157 divisions were fully motorized. The rest depended on horses for their artillery and baggage transport. The British caught another break when a German staff car was captured, revealing plans for the next attack to occur in the east, near Ypres, targeting the gap between the Belgian forces and the British left flank. General Brooke convinced Lord Gort to reposition one of his divisions, originally assigned for counterattack, to fill this gap. Upon learning that the French couldn't launch an offensive across the Somme, Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for War, directed Gort on the night of May 25 to prioritize the safety of the British Expeditionary Force instructing him to withdraw towards the Channel coast for evacuation. The War Cabinet, now confronted with the reality that the French army could not recover from its defeat, had to contemplate the consequences of Britain standing alone in the fight. Gort had already alerted London about the likely loss of all equipment for the British Expeditionary Force, expressing doubt that more than a few of its soldiers could be evacuated. Unbeknownst to Eden, an increasingly pressured Renault had been outmaneuvered by Marshal Pétain and General Weygand. Pétain had communicated with Pierre Laval, a politician who despised the British and was waiting for his chance to take Renault's position. Laval reached out to an Italian diplomat to explore the possibility of negotiating with Hitler through Mussolini. Weygand, the commanding officer, held the politicians accountable for a criminal lack of prudence in initiating the war. With Petain's backing, he insisted that France's pledge to avoid a separate peace be revoked, prioritizing the preservation of the army to maintain order. Renault agreed to travel to London the following day for discussions with the British government. Weygand's belief that Mussolini could be swayed to refrain from joining the conflict with promises of more colonies and that he might facilitate peace negotiations was entirely misguided. Hitler's assertion of victory prompted a hesitant Mussolini to inform both the Germans and his own military staff that Italy would enter the war shortly after June 5th. Both he and his generals were fully aware that Italy lacked the capacity for any substantial military action. They did contemplate an assault on Malta, but ultimately decided it was unnecessary, since they believed they could seize the island as soon as Britain faltered. In the days that followed, Mussolini reportedly stated, "This time I'll declare war, but I won't wage it." The chief victims of this disastrous ruse would be his poorly equipped armed forces. Bismarck once quipped that Italy had a grand appetite but weak teeth, a notion that would prove tragically accurate in the Second World War. On the morning of Sunday, May 26, as British troops retreated toward Dunkirk amidst a fierce storm, thunderclaps mingled with the booming of the artillery. The War Cabinet convened in London, unaware of Mussolini's plans. Lord Halifax suggested that the government consider reaching out to the Deuce to ascertain what terms Hitler might be willing to accept for peace. He had even met with the Italian ambassador privately the day before to gauge his perspective. Halifax believed that, without any help from the United States on the horizon, Britain lacked the strength to stand against Hitler alone. Churchill countered that British liberty and independence were the top priorities. He referenced a document prepared by the Chiefs of Staff titled British Strategy in a Certain Eventuality, essentially addressing the scenario of a French surrender. This paper outlined possible British strategies for fighting independently. Some parts turned out to be overly pessimistic. The report predicted that most of the British Expeditionary Force would be lost in France. The Admiralty only anticipated retrieving about 45,000 men, and the Chiefs of Staff feared the Luftwaffe would devastate the aircraft factories in the Midlands. Conversely, some assumptions were overly optimistic, such as the prediction that Germany's war economy would falter due to a lack of raw materials, even though Germany would control much of Western and Central Europe. Nonetheless, the key takeaway was that Britain could likely withstand an invasion as long as the RAF and Royal Navy remained intact. This was the crucial point that bolstered Churchill's argument against Halifax. Afterward, Churchill went to Admiralty House for lunch with Renault, who had just arrived in London. It became clear from Renault's comments that General Weygand's previously optimistic outlook had shifted to one of bleak defeatism. The French were already considering the potential loss of Paris. Renault even mentioned, although he would never sign a separate peace, he might be succeeded by someone who would. He was feeling pressure to convince the British to decrease our own contribution, hand over Gibraltar and Suez to the Italians. When Churchill returned to the War Cabinet and recounted this discussion, Halifax brought up his idea of reaching out to the Italian government again. Churchill needed to tread carefully. He could not afford to openly clash with Halifax, who had the loyalty of numerous conservatives, while his own position remained fragile. Fortunately, Chamberlain began to shift his support towards Churchill, who had treated him with considerable respect and generosity despite their prior conflicts. Churchill asserted that Britain should not bind itself to France if it was seeking terms. We should avoid getting trapped in such a situation before engaging in any significant conflict. No decisions must be made until it's clear how many from the British Expeditionary Force can be rescued. Regardless, Hitler's demands would undoubtedly hinder Britain from completing our rearmament. Churchill believed that Hitler would propose far more lenient conditions to France than to Britain. Yet the Foreign Secretary was set on pursuing negotiations. If we reach a point where the terms don't require us to give up our independence, it would be foolish not to accept. Churchill softly hinted that he was open to reaching out to Italy, but in reality, he was buying time. If a significant part of the British Expeditionary Force could be saved, both his own position and that of the nation would be greatly enhanced. That evening, Anthony Eden signaled to Gort, instructing him to fall back to the coast in coordination with the French and Belgian armies. At the same time, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay in Dover was ordered to initiate Operation Dynamo, the sea evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force. Unfortunately, Churchill's message to Weygand about the retreat to the Channel ports did not clarify the evacuation plan. It was mistakenly assumed that this was obvious under the circumstances. This would have serious repercussions for Britain's already strained relationship with France. The halt of the Panzer divisions allowed Gort's staff to establish a new defensive perimeter based on fortified villages, while most of the British Expeditionary Force withdrew. However, the French commanders in Flanders were furious to learn that the British intended to evacuate. Gort believed that London had informed General Weygand at the same time he received his orders to retreat to the coast. He also assumed the French had received similar instructions and was shocked to discover this was not true. From May 27th, the 2nd Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment and a battalion of the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry defended Cassel, south of Dunkirk. Troops held out in nearby farms, sometimes for 3 days, against overwhelmingly larger forces. Meanwhile, the British 2nd Division, redeployed to defend the canal line from La Bassée to Ayr, faced severe assaults. With their supply of anti-tank ammunition entirely spent, the weary and significantly diminished 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment resorted to charging forth with hand grenades, aiming to drop them into the paths of the advancing panzers. Those who remained in the battalion found themselves encircled by the SS Totenkopf and were taken as prisoners. That night, the SS executed 97 of them. On the Belgian front that same day, the German 255th Division sought revenge for their losses near Vinct by killing 78 civilians, falsely alleging that some were armed. The following day, a unit of the SS Leibstandarte, led by Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke at Wormhout, murdered nearly 90 British prisoners, most of whom were from the Royal Warwicks and serving in the rear guard. Thus, the brutal campaign against Poland had its grim echoes on the so-called civilized Western Front. To the south of the Somme, the British 1st Armoured Division launched a counterattack against a German stronghold. Yet again, French artillery and air support failed to materialize, leading to the 10th Hussars and the Queen's Bays losing 65 tanks, primarily to German anti-tank fire. A more coordinated counterattack was initiated by de Gaulle's 4th Armored Division against the German bridgehead near Abbeville, but this too was turned back. In London, on the 27th of May, the War Cabinet convened 3 times. The second meeting that afternoon may have marked the war's most crucial moment, when Nazi Germany could have seized victory. It was during this meeting that the growing rift between Halifax and Churchill became evident. Halifax was increasingly intent on enlisting Mussolini as a mediator to ascertain what terms Hitler might extend to France and Britain. He believed that delaying negotiations would only lead to worse terms. Churchill forcefully opposed this line of thinking, urging that they must continue to fight. "Even if we are defeated," he asserted, "we'd be no worse off than if we were to abandon the struggle now. Let's avoid being dragged down this slippery slope alongside France." He recognized that once negotiations began, they would find it impossible to backtrack and inspire a spirit of resistance among the populace. Churchill, at least, had the unspoken backing of Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, the two Labour leaders, as well as Sir Archibald Sinclair, the Liberal leader. Chamberlain, too, was swayed by Churchill's pivotal argument. During the tumultuous meeting, Halifax made it clear to Churchill that he would resign if his opinions were overlooked, but Churchill managed to calm him down afterwards. That evening brought more bad news. After the Belgian line along the River Lys was breached, King Leopold chose to surrender. The next day, he capitulated unconditionally to the Sixth Army, with General Oberst von Reichenau and his Chief of Staff, General-Lieutenant Friedrich Paulus, dictating the terms. The next surrender Paulus would oversee would be his own at Stalingrad, 2 years and 8 months later. The French government publicly condemned King Leopold's betrayal, but privately they were relieved. One member of the capitulating forces summed up the sentiment, saying, "Finally, we have a scapegoat." The British were not caught off guard by Belgium's fall. Gort, following General Brooke's advice, had sensibly moved his troops behind the Belgian lines to prevent a German breakthrough between Ypres and Comines on the eastern flank. General Weygand, now aware that the British had decided to withdraw, was furious about the lack of transparency. Unfortunately, he didn't order his units to evacuate until the next day, meaning French troops reached the beaches well after the British. Marshal Pétain argued that the absence of British support meant it was time to reconsider Renault's March agreement, not to pursue a separate peace. On the afternoon of May 28th, the War Cabinet reconvened, this time at the House of Commons at the Prime Minister's request. The clash between Halifax and Churchill erupted again, with Churchill taking an even firmer stance against any negotiations. He argued that if the British walked away from the conference table, all the forces of resolution at our disposal would vanish. Once the War Cabinet meeting concluded, Churchill called a meeting of the entire cabinet. He shared that he had contemplated negotiations with Hitler, but was convinced that Hitler's conditions would reduce Britain to a slave state, governed by a puppet regime. Their support was unwavering. Halifax had been decisively outmaneuvered. Britain would continue to fight until the end. Meanwhile, Hitler, not wanting to exhaust his dwindling panzer forces, limited their advance towards Dunkirk. They were to stop as soon as their artillery units were within range of the port. The shelling and bombing of the town commenced with full intensity, but it wasn't enough to thwart Operation Dynamo, the evacuation effort. Luftwaffe bombers, often still coming from bases in Germany, lacked proper fighter support and were regularly intercepted by Spitfire squadrons launching from nearer airfields in Kent. The beleaguered British soldiers packed into the sand dunes in town as they awaited their turn to board cursed the RAF, unaware that its fighters were engaging the German bombers further inland. Despite Goering's claims that he would wipe out the British forces, the Luftwaffe caused relatively few casualties. The devastating impact of the bombs and shells was significantly diminished by the soft sand dunes. More Allied soldiers perished on the beaches from strafing attacks than from bomb strikes. By the time the German infantry resumed their advance, the strong defense mounted by both British and French troops had stopped any breakthrough. Those few who escaped from the fortified villages were left exhausted, hungry, thirsty, and often injured. The more severely wounded had to be abandoned. With German forces surrounding them, the retreat was anxiety-filled, as they never knew when they might encounter an enemy unit. The evacuation kicked off on May 19th, removing wounded and rear troops, but the main operation began the night of May 26th. Following an appeal broadcast over the BBC, the Admiralty reached out to volunteer owners of small boats, including yachts, river launches, and cabin cruisers. They were instructed to meet first off Sheerness, then off Ramsgate. Around 600 small vessels participated in Operation Dynamo, nearly all manned by weekend sailors, enhancing the fleet of over 200 Royal Navy ships. Dunkirk was easily recognizable from a distance, both at sea and from the land. Columns of smoke spiraled into the sky from the town being bombed by German aircraft. Oil tanks burned fiercely, sending thick black smoke billowing upward. Every road leading into the town was clogged with abandoned and wrecked army vehicles. Tensions grew between senior British and French officers, particularly among the staff of Admiral John Abrial, the commander of Northern Naval Forces. The situation worsened as both British and French troops resorted to looting in Dunkirk, each side blaming the other. Many were intoxicated, seeking to quench their thirst with wine, beer, and spirits, as the main water supply was down. The beaches and port teemed with troops waiting to board. With each Luftwaffe attack, as Stuka sirens wailed like a swarm of monstrous seagulls diving in, men scattered in a panic. The cacophony was overwhelming, with all the anti-aircraft guns of the destroyers blazing away. Once the threat passed, the soldiers rushed back, desperate to maintain their spot in the line. Some broke under the pressure. There was little help for those suffering from combat fatigue. At night, soldiers stood in water up to their shoulders, waiting as lifeboats and smaller craft arrived to rescue them. Most were so exhausted and bogged down in their soaked uniforms that the frustrated sailors had to haul them over the sides, gripping their webbing. The Royal Navy faced just as many hardships as the soldiers they were rescuing. On May 29, under Hitler's orders, Goering launched a significant assault against the evacuation, resulting in the sinking or severe damage of 10 destroyers and numerous other vessels. This led the Admiralty to pull back larger fleet destroyers crucial for defending southern England. However, they were brought back the next day as the evacuation slowed, since each destroyer could evacuate up to 1,000 soldiers at once. That day also saw a fierce defense of the inner perimeter by the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, and the Royal Berkshires of the 3rd Infantry Division, managing to fend off German attacks that could have jeopardized further evacuations. French troops from the 68th Division continued to defend the western and southwestern sections of the Dunkirk perimeter, but tensions within the Franco-British alliance intensified. The French were convinced the British would prioritize their own troops, further complicated by contradictory orders from London. French soldiers often arrived at British embarkation points only to be denied entry, leading to heated confrontations. British troops, annoyed that the French carried packs while they had been told to leave their belongings behind, pushed them off the harbor wall into the sea. In another instance, British troops stormed a ship designated for the French, while several French soldiers attempting to board a British vessel were pushed back into the water. Even Major General Harold Alexander, the commander of the 1st Division, couldn't calm the fury of General Robert Fagalde and Admiral Abrial when he informed them his orders were to evacuate as many British soldiers as possible. They presented a letter from Lord Gort promising that 3 British divisions would remain to defend the perimeter. Admiral Abrial even threatened to halt British access to the port of Dunkirk. The issue was escalated to London and Paris, where Churchill was discussing matters with Renault, Weygand, and Admiral François Darlan, the head of the French Navy. Weygand acknowledged that Dunkirk could not last forever. Churchill pushed for the evacuation to proceed on equal terms, but that sentiment wasn't shared back in London. There, the prevailing thought was that since France was likely to surrender, the British needed to look out for themselves. Alliances are challenging enough in victory, but in defeat, they often lead to harsh accusations. By May 30th, it seemed that half of the British expeditionary force would be left behind. However, the next day, the Royal Navy and an array of small craft arrived: destroyers, minelayers, yachts, paddle steamers, tugs, lifeboats, fishing boats, and pleasure boats. Many smaller vessels transported soldiers from the beaches to the larger ships. One yacht, the Sundowner, belonged to Commander C.H. Lightoller, the last surviving officer of the Titanic. The miracle of Dunkirk was aided by the mostly calm sea during those critical days and nights. On board the destroyers, Royal Navy sailors distributed mugs of cocoa, tins of bully beef, and bread to the weary soldiers. Yet, as the Luftwaffe intensified attacks during the lulls in RAF fighter coverage, making it to a ship didn't always mean safety. The horrific injuries caused by air raids, the drowning soldiers as ships sank, and the desperate cries for help are haunting memories. The situation for the wounded left inside the Dunkirk perimeter was far worse, with medical personnel unable to provide much comfort to the dying. Even those who were evacuated found little relief upon reaching Dover. The sheer scale of the evacuation had overwhelmed the system. hospital trains dispatched them to various locations. One wounded soldier, returning from the horrors of Dunkirk, could barely believe his eyes when he glimpsed from the train window teams in white flannels playing cricket as if the country were still at peace. Many men once treated were discovered to have maggots in their wounds beneath field dressings, or they were suffering from gangrene, leading to amputations. On the morning of June 1st, the rear guard at Dunkirk, which included the 1st Guards Brigade, faced an intense German offensive across the Berg's Furnace Canal. Some soldiers and even entire platoons faltered, but the courage displayed that day resulted in a Victoria Cross and several other commendations. Daylight evacuation had to be halted due to heavy losses by the Royal Navy, including one hospital ship sunk and another damaged. The last ships reached Dunkirk during the night of June 3rd. Major General Alexander, in a motorboat, made a final inspection along the beaches and harbor, calling out for any remaining soldiers to reveal themselves. Shortly before midnight, Captain Bill Tennant, the naval officer accompanying him, felt ready to inform Admiral Ramsay in Dover that their mission was complete. Instead of the 45,000 troops the Admiralty had aimed to rescue, the Royal Navy's warships and various civilian vessels had successfully evacuated around 338,000 Allied troops, of which 193,000 were British and the remainder French. Approximately 80,000 soldiers, mainly French, were left behind due to confusion and delays by their commanders. During the campaign in Belgium and northeastern France, the British had suffered 68,000 casualties. Almost all of their remaining tanks and vehicles, most of their artillery, and the vast majority of their supplies had to be destroyed. The Polish forces in France also made their way to Britain, which prompted Goebbels to dismissively refer to them as the Sikorsky tourists. The response in Britain was oddly mixed, with some inflated fears, but also a sense of emotional relief that the British Expeditionary Force had been rescued. The Ministry of Information worried that the morale among the public was almost too good. Yet, the threat of invasion had truly begun to take hold. Rumors circulated about German parachutists disguised as nuns. Some individuals even thought that in Germany, mentally ill patients were being recruited for a suicide corps, and that the Germans were tunneling under Switzerland to emerge in Toulouse. The looming threat of invasion stirred up a chaotic fear of outsiders among the populace. Following the evacuation from Dunkirk, it was noted that French soldiers were greeted with warmth, while Dutch and Belgian refugees faced rejection. The Germans quickly moved on to the next phase of their offensive. On June 6th, they launched an attack along the River Somme and the Aisne, enjoying a significant advantage in both numbers and air power. The French forces, having regrouped after the initial shock of defeat, fought bravely, but it was too late. Churchill, warned by Dowding about the insufficient number of fighters to defend Britain, turned down French requests for more squadrons to cross the Channel. Over 100,000 British troops remained south of the Somme, including the 51st Highland Division, which soon found itself isolated at St. Valery alongside the French 41st Division. In a bid to keep France in the war, Churchill dispatched another expeditionary force under General Sir Alan Brooke across the Channel. Before departing, Brooke cautioned Eden that, despite understanding the diplomatic importance of his mission, the government had to acknowledge that it held no chance of military success. While some French troops fought valiantly, many others began to slip away, joining the throngs of refugees fleeing towards the southwest of France. Fear escalated with rumors of poison gas and German atrocities. Wealthy individuals led the exodus in motorcars, seemingly well prepared, quickly consuming the dwindling petrol supplies. The middle class followed in their more modest vehicles, mattresses strapped on top and filled inside with cherished belongings, including a dog or a cat or a caged canary. Less fortunate families set out on foot, using bicycles, handcarts, horses, and prams to carry their possessions. With traffic jams stretching for hundreds of kilometers, they often moved no faster than the cars, whose engines overheated in the heat, inching forward at a crawl. As this stream of frightened people, numbering around 8 million, made their way southwest, they soon discovered that not only was fuel scarce, but food was hard to come by as well. The overwhelming influx of city residents, grabbing every baguette and grocery in sight, soon sparked a mounting resistance to empathy and a growing resentment, likened to a swarm of locusts. This reaction came despite the many who had been injured by German planes targeting the congested roads. Yet again, it was the women who endured the most, stepping up with courage and sacrifice, while the men succumbed to tears of despair. On June 10th, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, fully aware of Italy's military and resource shortcomings. He was eager not to miss the opportunity for territorial gain before peace was achieved. However, the Italian assault in the Alps, which the Germans were unaware of, ended in disaster. The French lost just over 200 men, while the Italians faced around 6,000 casualties, including over 2,000 severe frostbite cases. To add to the confusion, the French government had relocated to the Loire Valley, setting up various ministries and headquarters in different chateaux. The following day, Churchill flew to Braire-on-Loire for discussions with French leaders. Accompanied by a squadron of Hurricanes, he and his team landed at a deserted airstrip nearby. Churchill was joined by General Sir John Dill, now Chief of the General Staff, Major General Hastings Ismay, the War Cabinet Secretary, and Major General Edward Spears, his personal envoy to the French government. They traveled to the Château du Muguet, the temporary base of General Weygand. In the somber dining room, they were met by Paul Renaud, a small man with high arched eyebrows and a face weary from fatigue. Renaud appeared on the verge of nervous collapse, flanked by a disgruntled Weygand and Marshal Pétain. In the background stood Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle, now Renaud's Undersecretary of War, who had been Pétain's protégé until a falling out occurred before the war. Spears observed that despite Renaud's courteous greeting, the British delegation felt as if they were poor relations at a funeral reception. Weygand painted the disaster in the bleakest light. Despite wearing a heavy black suit on that warm day, Churchill tried to sound warm and upbeat, blending his English and French in his unique style. Unaware that Weygand had already ordered the abandonment of Paris, he proposed a defense strategy that involved fighting house by house and engaging in guerrilla tactics. These suggestions appalled both Weygand and Pétain, who broke his silence to exclaim, "That would be the destruction of the country." Their primary worry was to maintain enough troops to prevent revolutionary chaos. They were fixated on the fear that the communists might take over an unguarded Paris. Attempting to deflect blame for the French resistance's failure, Weygand requested additional RAF fighter squadrons, fully aware that the British would decline. Just days prior, he had pointed fingers at the Popular Front and school teachers for instilling a lack of patriotism and sacrifice in children, not at the generals. Pétain echoed similar thoughts, telling Spears, "This country has been rotted by politics." France had become so deeply divided that accusations of treason were inevitable. Churchill and his team returned to London disillusioned, although they managed to secure a promise to be consulted before an armistice. From the British perspective, key concerns included the fate of the French fleet and whether Renaud's government would fight on from North Africa. However, Weygand and Pétain firmly rejected this notion, convinced that without a government, France would spiral into chaos. The next evening, on June 12th, Weygand openly called for an armistice during a Council of Ministers meeting, despite not being a member. Renaud attempted to remind him that Hitler was not like the elderly Wilhelm I of 1871, but rather a new Genghis Khan. Unfortunately, this marked Renaud's last effort to manage his commander-in-chief. Paris stood nearly empty, with black smoke billowing from the Standard Oil refinery, set ablaze at the request of the French General Staff and the American Embassy to prevent the Germans from accessing fuel. Franco-American relations were quite friendly in 1940. The U.S. ambassador, William Bullitt, was so trusted by the French that he was temporarily appointed mayor and tasked with negotiating the capital's surrender to the Germans. After German officers were fired upon while under a flag of truce near the Porte Saint-Denis at the northern edge of Paris, General Oberst Georg von Küchler, the commander of the German 10th Army, ordered the bombardment of Paris. Bullitt stepped in and successfully saved the city from destruction. On June 13th, as the Germans prepared to enter Paris, Churchill traveled to Tours for an urgent meeting. His worst fears were realized. At Weygand's urging, Renaud inquired whether Britain would relieve France from its commitment not to seek a separate peace. Only a few, including George Mandel, the Interior Minister, and the junior General de Gaulle, were determined to continue fighting, no matter the cost. Renaud, while agreeing with them, appeared, as Spears noted, to have been so overwhelmed by the defeatists that he had become a paralyzed figure. When Churchill confronted the French request for a separate peace, he expressed understanding of their situation. However, the defeatists misinterpreted his words as agreement, a claim he vehemently denied. Churchill was unwilling to release the French from their pledge until it was guaranteed that the Germans could not seize the French fleet, as that would significantly increase the chances of a successful invasion of Britain. He urged Renaud to contact President Roosevelt to explore whether the United States might assist France in such dire circumstances. Every day that France resisted would improve Britain's chances to prepare for a German attack. Later that evening, a council of ministers convened at the Château de Congé. Weygand, advocating for an armistice, falsely claimed that the communists had taken control in Paris, with their leader Maurice Thorez occupying the Palais de l'Élysée. This assertion was completely unfounded, as Mandel quickly confirmed with the police prefect in the capital. Although Weygand was silenced, Marshal Pétain pulled out a paper and began to read. He not only pushed for an armistice, but also dismissed any notion of the government leaving France. "I will stay with the French people to share their pain and suffering," he declared, revealing his intention to lead France into servitude. Renaud, despite having enough ministerial support and backing from the presidents of both chambers of Parliament, lacked the resolve to dismiss him. A disastrous compromise was reached. They would wait for President Roosevelt's response before making a final decision about an armistice. The following day, the government departed for Bordeaux, marking the tragic end of an era. General Brooke's deepest fears were confirmed shortly after he arrived in Cherbourg. He reached Weygand's headquarters near Briare on the evening of June 13th, only to find Weygand at the Château de Congé for a council. Brooke met him the next day. Weygand seemed more troubled by his military career not ending on a high note than by the army's collapse. Brooke called London, voicing his disagreement with the orders for the 2nd British Expeditionary Force to defend a position in Brittany, a plan that de Gaulle and Churchill held dear. General Dill immediately understood. He decided to halt any further reinforcements to France. They both agreed that all British troops still in northwest France should retreat to ports in Normandy and Brittany for evacuation. Back in London, Churchill was appalled. An increasingly frustrated Brooke spent 30 minutes on the phone with him, explaining the situation. The Prime Minister insisted that Brooke's mission was to assure the French of British support. Brooke countered that it was impossible to inspire a dead army. Continuing the fight would only waste valuable troops. Brooke was irked by the suggestion that he was hesitant and stood his ground. Ultimately, Churchill recognized it was the only viable option. German soldiers were puzzled by how willingly many French troops surrendered. One soldier from the 62nd Infantry Division noted, "We were the first to enter a particular town, and the French soldiers had been sitting in the bars for 2 days, waiting to be taken prisoner. That's how it was in France, the celebrated Grande Nation." On June 16th, Marshal Pétain announced he would resign unless the government sought an immediate armistice, but he was convinced to wait for a reply from London. President Roosevelt's response to Renaud's earlier plea was sympathetic, but offered no promises. General de Gaulle from London read a proposal over the phone, initially suggested by Jean Monnet, who later became known as the founding father of the European ideal, but was then handling arms purchases. Britain and France should come together as a united state with a single war cabinet. Churchill was excited about this idea to keep France in the fight, and Renaud felt hopeful as well. But when Renaud presented it to the council, most met it with harsh contempt. Pétain referred to it as marriage with a corpse, while others worried that perfidious Albion aimed to take control of their nation and colonies during their weakest hour. A deeply disheartened Reynaud turned to President Lebrun and resigned. He was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Lebrun urged him to reconsider, but Reynaud had lost faith in resisting the call for an armistice. He even proposed that Marshal Pétain be asked to form a government to negotiate the armistice. Although Lebrun generally supported Reynaud, he felt compelled to go along with his suggestion. At 11 p.m., Pétain led a new council of ministers. The Third Republic was essentially finished. Some historians have reasonably argued that the Third Republic had already been dismantled by an internal military coup led by Pétain, Weygand, and Admiral Darlan, who had been swayed on June 11th at Briare. Darlan's task was to ensure that the French fleet could not be used to evacuate the government and troops to North Africa to carry on the fight. That night, de Gaulle returned to Bordeaux in a plane sent by Churchill. Upon arrival, he learned that his ally had stepped down and he was no longer part of the government. Any moment, he could receive orders from Weygand, which would be difficult to refuse as a soldier. Trying to maintain a low profile, which was tough given his height and recognizable face, he met with Reynaud and expressed his intention to return to England to continue the struggle. Reynaud provided him with 100,000 francs from secret funds. Spears attempted to convince George Mandel to join them, but he declined. As a Jew, he did not wish to be seen as a deserter, but he underestimated the rising anti-Semitism in his country. This would eventually cost him his life. De Gaulle, his aide-de-camp, and Spears took off from the airfield filled with wrecked planes. As they flew to London via the Channel Islands, Pétain announced to France that he was pursuing an armistice. The French had suffered 92,000 fatalities and 200,000 injuries, with nearly 2 million men captured as prisoners of war. The French army, torn apart by both communist and far-right propaganda, had facilitated an effortless win for Germany, alongside providing them with substantial motor transport, which would be leveraged in the subsequent invasion of the Soviet Union. In Britain, the news of France's surrender left people stunned into silence. The government emphasized the gravity of the situation by announcing that church bells would now only ring to signal an invasion threat. Official pamphlets, delivered to every household by postmen, warned that in the event of a German landing, residents should remain at home. Anyone attempting to flee and crowd the roads would face machine gunning from the Luftwaffe. General Brooke promptly set up the evacuation of the remaining British forces from France, which proved fortunate, as Pétain's announcement put his troops in a difficult position. By the morning of June 17th, 57,000 out of 124,000 Army and RAF personnel still in France had successfully escaped. A significant maritime operation was initiated to rescue as many others as possible from Saint-Nazaire in Brittany. It's believed that over 6,000 servicemen and British civilians boarded the Cunard liner Lancastria that day. German planes bombed the ship, resulting in a tragic loss of life with over 3,500 victims, many of whom were trapped below deck. This marked the worst maritime disaster in British history. Despite this horrific event, another 191,000 Allied troops made it back to England during this second evacuation. Churchill welcomed de Gaulle to London, concealing his disappointment that neither Reynaud nor Mandel were present. On June 18th, the day after arriving, de Gaulle delivered his broadcast to France via the BBC, a moment that would be commemorated for years to come. Duff Cooper, the pro-French Minister of Information, found the Foreign Office strongly opposed to de Gaulle's speech, fearing it might provoke Pétain's government amidst uncertainty over the future of the French fleet. However, with backing from Churchill and the cabinet, Cooper instructed the BBC to proceed. In this iconic address, albeit reaching only a small audience at the time, de Gaulle used the broadcast to rally support for the Free French, or La France combattante. Though he couldn't launch a direct attack on the Pétain administration, it was an inspiring rallying cry, later refined to be even more impactful. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. He exhibited a remarkable foresight regarding the war's future. Recognizing that France had been overcome by a new kind of modern, mechanized warfare, he foresaw that America's industrial might would shift the balance of what was becoming a global conflict. In doing so, he dismissed the notion held by defeatists that Britain would fall within weeks and that Hitler would impose a peace across Europe. On the same day, Churchill delivered his finest hour speech in the House of Commons, emphasizing the urgent need for the United States to join the fight for freedom. The Battle of France had indeed concluded, and the Battle of Britain was on the horizon.